Hi, David. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your work and your focus?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is David Santoro. I am President and CEO of Pacific Forum. Pacific Forum is a foreign policy think tank based in the beautiful island of Oahu, part of Hawaii, and we focus on Indo Pacific security and strategic issues. And so I've been working at Pacific Forum for the past nearly 13 years. Now I'm a PhD in international relations, so I've been working on those issues for quite a long time. I grew up in Europe, and so I grew up in France. I'm a dual national now, but I initially growing up in Europe and working on those questions in Europe, I was essentially working on Europe and the Euro-Atlantic. But then I moved to Australia for part of my graduate work. Ended up focusing a lot more on the Indo Pacific, and of course, at the time we called it the Asia Pacific. But I focused my work on those on this region, and I was working primarily on non-proliferation, nuclear security, essentially hard security issues. And over the past, I want to say 10, 15 years, I've moved to more to questions of like strategic questions, strategic stability questions, nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and also grand strategy question. And so a lot of the work that I do is focused on the Indo-Pacific, although I remain interested in Europe, but it's focused on the Indo-Pacific and looking at major power relations. So a lot of it is about China, Russia, India as well, US allies and partners, and more generally regional security and strategic dynamics. So that's essentially who I am and the work that I do.
Thank you so much. So you wrote a study. Can you tell us more about the study, the goals, and the rationale behind it? And in other words, what did you try to achieve with it?
Sure. So I did a study. It was not just my study, by the way. It's a study that our President Emeritus and I co-led, Ralph Costa and I. And essentially, we decided to look at what the world would look like if Taiwan were to be taken over by Beijing. And the goal, well, first of all, we decided to do this because obviously one of the key findings of a separate process that Ralph Costa has been running, a dialogue, track 2 US Taiwan dialogue on deterrence and defense issues. One of the key findings of that dialogue is that obviously Taiwan has been under a lot of pressure from Beijing politically, economically, militarily, and that there is, frankly, still is, was and still is a really urgent need to strengthen deterrence and defense. And so we decided to, number one, do that dialogue to try and assess how much deterrence, how much defense we needed to strengthen to try and avoid that scenario where you have mainland China taking over Taiwan. But beyond that, what we quickly realized as we were going through that dialogue is that the United States and others over the past few years have been focusing on what happens if there is a war between the United States and China over Taiwan. And the focus was, well, if there's a war, this is the United States could win, China could win, and this is what we should expect. But no one actually, very few people asked themselves what would happen if you have a scenario in which China actually wins and takes over Taiwan. what would the world look like if that actually happens? And so we thought, A, that this was intellectually interesting to do this, and then B, there was a very practical reason as well attached to that, which is that we have been worried that in the United States, even in Taiwan, and frankly, elsewhere in the world, that people were not paying sufficient attention to that problem set. And so one way that we could, at our level, contribute to raising awareness of the problem was to try and think about what the world would look like if China were to actually take over Taiwan. And so by fleshing out what that world would look like, then it would help people realize, oh my God, we really need to um, realize what that world would look like, and therefore take proper measures to make sure that we prevent that outcome. And so again, intellectually stimulating and practical, if you will, where our sense was that there was really and still is a need to actually raise awareness of that problem. And so that's why we decided to do the study, instead of having just another exercise or paper on what would happen if a war breaks out.
Thank you so much. So you've just explained the purpose of the study. Can you now tell us more about the methodology that you've embraced, and how did you decide to proceed to accomplish your goals?
Sure. So, first of all, the dialogue that I mentioned earlier that Ralph Costa led was at the track two level, which means at the unofficial level. And this is important because obviously you can have a much more candid discussion and engage in topics that are sensitive and that are difficult to discuss at the track one, the official level. And similarly, that study is in the same spirit. Obviously, those are difficult issues to discuss, but as a think tank, you can do it without a problem. And so what we decided to do from a methodology standpoint, the how, if you will, of the study, is to just, instead of us telling people this is what we think would happen, we actually commissioned papers asking scholars from a number of countries to tell us what, from their perspective or their country's perspective, that world would look like if China were to take over Taiwan. And so we commissioned someone from the United States, someone from Australia, someone from India, someone from Japan, someone from the Republic of Korea, and then someone from Europe. So six papers total, to give essentially a national perspective on the implication that such a development, the takeover of Taiwan by China, would actually mean from the perspective of their country, what it would also mean in the relationship that that country would have with the United States, and the implications for not just regional security, but also global security and stability. So we really sort of, in a way, this was an investigative a process where we reached out to people so that we could have a better and wider and more diverse set of perspectives on those issues. The other thing, I guess, from a methodological standpoint that I thought I'd mention is that obviously a lot would depend on how the takeover of Taiwan would happen. So there's two alternatives that we thought would flesh out. One is a situation in which you have a takeover without an intervention from the United States and its allies. Essentially, China proceeds, takes over Taiwan, and that's it. And so that's the first scenario. And the second scenario is a situation in which you have a Chinese takeover of Taiwan, but you have a US and allied intervention to try and prevent it. And so we thought that when we asked the scholars to reflect on the implications of a Chinese takeover of Taiwan, we would ask them to think about how this differs, what if the implications are any different in a situation in which there is resistance from the United States and allies and others, and so that's scenario number one. And scenario number two, when you have a situation in which there is no resistance. So that's how we I guess reflected on those implications. We asked the scholars to think about what that means, or whether that how that situation would change based on whether or not there is resistance to a Chinese takeover.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Um, can you tell us about your key findings? Plainly, what have you discovered and learned with that study?
Sure. So I'm guessing we'll get into more specifics, but from the outset, what I would say is that the primary finding of the study is that Taiwan's fall would basically have devastating consequences for the United States and many countries in the region, and frankly, even beyond the Indo Pacific. So that's the primary key finding, and you see that throughout the 6 papers that we've commissioned. Every single scholar agrees that if that happens, it would be a bad outcome. And so the logical consequence of that is that the United States, its allies, and many others need to take action, major action, to prevent such development. And that's why we've been talking so much about strengthening deterrence and defense in the US-Taiwan relationship, and frankly also encouraging others from the region to join in strengthening deterrence to make sure that that situation, that outcome, does not pan out. So that's the primary finding. Another important finding as well is that it does not matter too much how it happens, whether or not you have U.S. and allied intervention to try and prevent China from taking over Taiwan. Um, it's certainly worse if you have no or very little intervention, but in the end, Taiwan's fall to the PRC would be earth-shattering, regardless of whether or not you have an intervention from the U.S. And others. The consequences would essentially be that U.S. power and influence would be eclipsed by the PRC. The US would lose major influence in the region. This could even lead to the advent of a Pax Sinica, so domination of China, certainly of the region, perhaps even beyond. And it could even lead many beyond just Beijing to pursue their interest much more aggressively, certainly in the region, but also beyond. I guess we'll talk about this a little later, but nuclear proliferation could also take place in several parts of Asia and beyond. And so what follows from those findings, again, is that um, what what really we've discovered, and when you think about policy recommendations, is that they should be a very strong effort to considerably strengthen collective deterrence and defense in the Indo-Pacific. And this is frankly something that has become even more critical in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because what is happening in Europe, many people in Asia now are realizing, well, if it happens somewhere, it could happen anywhere, and certainly also in the Indo Pacific. So, in terms of key findings, or at least primary findings, this is what I would identify as um, again the main things that we've discovered.
Thank you so much. So what do regional countries think Washington's next move is going to be after Taiwan's fall? And what are the implications for the United States?
Well, I mean, there is what I would say is that the United States, especially these days, and as you know, we are in an election year. Um, there is a lot of uncertainty about Washington's next move. Uh, you know, when it comes to its foreign policy generally. Um, but if after Taiwan falls, well, let me rephrase that. After Taiwan's fall, the six authors made clear that it would be very uncertain to predict what U.S. policy would be. One author said that he was very confident that if the United States essentially loses, um, then it could actually lead to a so-called Fortress America approach, because the United States would be badly damaged by the outcome of essentially losing Taiwan. Some, though, argued that turning and running is really not what the United States does, and that it's very deep in America's DNA is the willingness to turn around and fight and stay involved, even if Taiwan were to fall. The United States essentially would not give up. So that was the view of several authors. Others also said that it would be situational. It would be situational. It would really depend on what happens, even though that the belief is that the United States should try and restore the credibility of its alliances and essentially continue to confront the PRC. Many of our authors as well, talked about the need to build, so many people will say, an Asian NATO. Now, I don't like that terminology because NATO, as you know, means the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so it can be Asian by definition. But many authors talked about building an Asian equivalent to NATO, if I can use those terms, essentially as a reaction to what would have happened, and the goal of that organization would be to actually prevent further PRC adventurism and ultimately down the line possibly retake Taiwan. The other thing that I guess I'll mention is that one of the recommendations was that the United States should not lose sight of the fact that its allies, partners, and friends expect a lot from Washington, especially leadership when times are very difficult, and that therefore retreating to Fortress America, as one author said was a possibility, would be actually very bad, and that essentially if Taiwan were to fall, then many allies would expect the United States to show leadership, to have a leadership role, to try and restore the credibility of its alliances, and then possibly build new organizations like an Asian equivalent to NATO, to prevent adventurism and ultimately retake Taiwan. So that's essentially um, what most of the authors concluded. Uh, in all the recommendations and um, the papers, you do see a lot of uncertainty, however, on what Washington's next move would be.
Thank you very much. Um, so can you tell us what is China likely to do if it were successful in taking over Taiwan, and what, as a result, should the United States do?
Yes. So all the authors in our study concurred that the PRC would become more aggressive towards its neighbors if it were successful in taking over Taiwan. So no one actually concluded that having recovered Taiwan, uh, Beijing would then sit back and set on its laurels, and essentially that's it. We shouldn't expect uh, anything else from China. Um, all of our authors said that there would be an increased risk by China. So, a Japanese author, for instance, feared that Japan would be next, especially if it participated in an attempt to defend Taiwan. Others saw the South China Sea as a likely area for increased PRC assertiveness. um, the Indian author talked about a possible um, flare up of conflict on the PRC Indian border. And Australian author talked about a massive expansion of PRC influence in the South Pacific. So wherever you're looking, wherever you are in the world, essentially our authors were talking about we're likely to see major um, PRC influence and growing confidence in being able to push the envelope and do more. So, as a result, one of the recommendations was that the United States should try and rally the region and the world to prevent the PRC from taking Taiwan, uh, essentially by showing that such a development would have a very direct impact on many countries, and that even though from at the outset, if you're sitting in Australia, some people might think, well, if Taiwan is taken over, how does that impact me? The reality is that maybe the first move would not directly impact you, but the second move would definitely be have a direct impact in addition to indirect impacts, and therefore it is incumbent of the United States to try and raise awareness way beyond the immediate region that this is a scenario that we should absolutely avoid. Hence, the need to strengthen deterrence and defense, and frankly make it a lot more collective in operations so that we prevent that outcome.
Thank you. So I guess following that, my next question would be, what is Taiwan's strategic significance, and what then does and should that mean for the United States and the region?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that Taiwan is in a very strategic location in the Indo Pacific, and we've known that for a very very long time. It is military. It has military and intelligence capacity, um, and its location can help Japan and others in East Asia to avoid the threats of PRC expansionism. And so, if Taiwan were to fall to the PRC, what it would mean is that Beijing would gain very unique access to military bases and intelligence facilities that would give it direct access very very deep into the Pacific. So that's one thing. But in addition to getting a critical intelligence gathering hub from the United States and its allies, and having all the impacts that we've talked about, um, Beijing would also be able to hold U.S. forces in Okinawa and Guam at direct risk, and also be able to invade vast territories of Japan and the Philippines, while also strengthening its dominance in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. So, bottom line is that um, the net result of a Chinese takeover Taiwan would essentially give China much more strategic access all across East Asia and maybe further. And therefore, what we discussed a little bit earlier, that it would lead to more PRC um, uh, assertiveness and aggressiveness, it makes sense because it would, by virtue of what Taiwan is, it would just give China um, a lot more access, a lot more capability, and therefore a lot more flexibility to do what it wants um, against the region. And again, so the recommendation on what should be done as a result is that need to rally the region around the danger of a PRC takeover of Taiwan. And so while we need to emphasize the military dangers that would come next, which, as I mentioned, would be greater PRC dominance of the region, um, it would mean more than that, because it would also mean the establishment of a PRC sphere of influence that would be tightly controlled by Beijing. So again, back to what I was mentioning earlier, the need to strengthen deterrence.
Yeah, so what are other authoritarian countries likely to do if Beijing successfully took over Taiwan? And what should be done as a result?
So that's another finding that was consistent across the different papers that we commissioned. Uh, all the authors agreed that we are likely to see more aggression by other actors as a result of a successful PRC takeover of Taiwan. So, the Korean author talked about North Korea being encouraged, if you will, to be more aggressive if China were to win. Iran as well was mentioned as a possibility. Some, particularly a European author, talked about Moscow being a lot more aggressive as a result. And essentially, the key finding on that particular topic is that um, we would move into a world where um, you will see more aggression, not less. And so, in terms of recommendation, um, the authors essentially reminded that it was important for leaders in public statements and in private discussions with its allies and partners. US leaders should again point out that the advent of a free for all regional and international order would have disastrous consequences for everyone. And that if the goal is maintain, as we like to say, maintain international order, we can't let that happen, because it would lead to more disorder, not more order.
That makes a lot of sense. Now I would like to tap into something that you completely and definitely master. What would be the implications of Taiwan's fall on nuclear proliferation, and what does that suggest for the US extended deterrence?
Yeah, so that's actually another key findings that was consistent across the six papers, and that is that nuclear proliferation would very likely follow the fall of Taiwan, not only in Asia but even possibly beyond Asia. So, you had some authors talking about Japan, South Korea, and Australia that would consider going nuclear. Um, I think only the Indian author expressed doubts that nuclear proliferation would definitely happen. And that is because um, it would be still difficult for a number of countries to do so. But all the what I thought was very interesting is that all the authors, perhaps again with the exception of the Indian author, the U.S., the Japanese, the Australian, and the South Korean authors all regarded proliferation by others as absolutely inevitable, while they were a lot more nuanced when it comes to proliferation by their country. And so, if you if you are the Japanese author, for instance, the assessment is, South Korea will definitely go nuclear as a result of that. But then the Japanese author also explained that when it comes to Japan, well, it would not be automatic that Japan goes nuclear. And then if you're sitting in Seoul, the South Korean author said that Japan was very likely to go nuclear, and so would Seoul as well. But he also explained that going nuclear for Seoul was also not a given. So overall, the assessment when it comes to nuclear proliferation is very negative. There's a very strong belief that nuclear proliferation would happen, but it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying it would definitely happen, especially when you're not when you're looking at your own country, if you will. And then in terms of, I think the second part of your question was extended deterrence. Well, yeah. All I say about this is that right now there are very good reasons to strengthen U.S. Extended deterrence because the Indo Pacific security environment is deteriorating, because you see problems emerging also in Europe and beyond. If Taiwan were to fall to China, my guess, and frankly the assessment of the six authors was that strengthening U.S. extended deterrence would become even more essential, because we would be in an even more dangerous system, and as a result, it is critical. It would be even more critical to strengthen it, despite the fact that obviously the credibility of it will have been damaged.
And so, what would be the implications of Taiwan's fall on U.S. alliances and new partnerships? And what should the United States then do now, given that?
So, throughout the study and across the papers, the feeling was that some U.S. alliances could break as a result, and that at a minimum, the fall of Taiwan would considerably reshape strategic relations in the Indo Pacific. So one author, for instance, assessed that the Philippines and Thailand would likely break their alliances with the United States, because those alliances, are already fragile, and the assessment was made that they would simply surrender to PRC hegemony. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is the assessment by one author. Others talked about the possible bandwagoning of many states towards the PRC as the new center of power, that essentially they would probably not break their alliances with their alliance with the United States, but certainly shift towards China a lot in much more direct ways. And essentially what would emerge would be an axis of authoritarian states as a result. And so here, the recommendation was that you need to strengthen alliances and the U.S. nuclear umbrella on current U.S. allies. But frankly, the United States should consider deploying its nuclear umbrella over other countries, and starting with more clearer commitments vis-a-vis the Philippines to again, strengthen the alliance and strengthen extended deterrence.
Thank you so much. So what does this study find when it comes to establishing nuclear sharing arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, and what should the United States do in this regard?
So this is actually something that we did not expect. A discussion on nuclear sharing, a discussion specifically on a region-wide nuclear sharing arrangement similar to the one that that the United States has with its NATO members. So some authors mentioned it. Some said that this is something that would be beneficial. Others completely ruled out the option, saying that this is not something that we're likely to see. But some did say that this is it would be a possibility that this is something that the United States could consider doing to essentially enhance the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, could become part of an Asian equivalent to NATO, and that yes, it may very well look different from what it looks like in NATO, but that the United States would try and do more nuclear planning with its Indo Pacific allies. So overall, the discussion about nuclear sharing came up as something that could happen, but we saw very strong disagreements about what would happen. Now, right now, as we speak, I'm actually preparing a monograph with a couple of colleagues on the benefits, the costs, and the risks of establishing nuclear sharing arrangements in the Indo-Pacific. And I don't want to reveal too much, but even though we are learning that there is interest in allies essentially learning more about US nuclear weapons, their role, how nuclear planning works, we tend to think that nuclear sharing as it exists in Europe would be very difficult, if not impossible, to establish in the Indo-Pacific. But certainly, I think what it reveals when it comes to thinking about nuclear sharing arrangements in the aftermath of the fall of Taiwan is the fact that uh, the need to strengthen extended deterrence would be um, so high that many voices would be strong in pushing for more involvement of U.S. allies when it comes to nuclear planning. And I think this is where this is why we saw a number of authors talk about the need for nuclear sharing. And so, at a minimum, what it means is that again, you need to strengthen alliances, you need to strengthen extended deterrence, and yes, you need to actually involve U.S. allies in the making of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. You need to involve them in uh, some of the planning that is being done, so that they feel that they have a say in how this is done. And it's important now. It would be even more important if Taiwan were to fall.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, what does this study suggest when it comes to deterrence and defense in the Indo-Pacific, and what do you think should happen now?
Well, I mean, I think what it says is that we need to continue the efforts that we have started several years back now, which is the situation is not good. It's not improving. It's getting worse, and we need to strengthen collective deterrence and defense. And we are doing it already. We are making progress. But what's not clear to me is that the progress we all making collectively, bilaterally, trilaterally, and so on, it's not clear to me that that progress is sufficiently fast to meet the rising threat level. And so what we should do is double down, well, from a US perspective, what the United States should do, from my standpoint, is that we should double down on our defense arrangements and security assistance to strength to allies and partners that feel threatened, and we should do that in with Taiwan as well. We should also encourage allies and partners to do a lot more to manage their own defense, because there's certainly a lot that the United States can and should do, but there's a lot that U.S. allies and partners also should do. They are, after all, on the front line of the problem, and so we need to do more, but they also need to do more, and we need to do more collectively. So, are we better off than a few years ago? Yes. Is that sufficient? I don't think it is. Can it ever be sufficient? I don't know, but I worry that we are satisfied sometimes by seeing progress, but not clear to me that the threat is being met. And so we need to do more, and we need to do more faster.
Thank you. I have one more question for you. What does the study say about US overall policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, and what happened in the short to medium term?
So I think what it says, I'll mention one thing about this. As you know, the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Taiwan has been one of strategic ambiguity. We will not say whether or not we would come to Taiwan's defense, and we would not spell out the circumstances in which we would do something or not. That's been the standard policy. That said, and people have been calling for, some people have been calling for a shift in policy, which many have labeled strategic clarity, which is a policy that would say we would definitely act if there is aggression against Taiwan. A, I don't think it will happen, and B, I don't think it should happen. The reality is the United States and I would argue Taiwan and others benefit from the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity. It's because you put China on the back foot by doing this. Now, having said that, and this is one of the conclusions of our study, and also it came up in the dialogue that Ralph Costa ran simultaneously as we were conducting that study, is that even though we should stick with the policy of strategic ambiguity, we should also do everything we can to enhance deterrence and be able to defeat a Chinese aggression over the island. And so, even though you keep the policy, you would keep the policy of strategic ambiguity, we should also do a lot more to be operationally ready to respond if there is a Chinese aggression. So the recommendation, if you will, what I think should happen is more at the operational level, but no change at the policy level.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Shanna. My pleasure.